So the closing line of that passage, if it's possible, so far as depends on you, live peaceably with all. The way we say it in the community statement, we strive to avoid offense. I got the opportunity to avoid offense twice in the last couple weeks. The first was 2 Saturdays ago when I was presiding over the memorial service for 3 of our dear friends who were killed. And I quoted one of them, and I said, "Shit happens." And the next Monday, so 2 days later, we were working out some GI issues with June. We were down at Arnold Palmer Children's Hospital meeting with a doctor, and I got 3 calls from a number that I don't know, and in my mind that means emergency. So I stepped into the hallway, stopped the doctor, and I called the number back, and this gentleman said, "Hi, I was at the memorial on Saturday, and I thought you did a good job, but I just wanted to tell you how offended I was by the word shit, and using profanity in the house of God." And what I wanted to say, so yeah, well, no.
Please enlighten us.
So I would have said, right? Instead, I said, I'm at the Children's Hospital with my daughter. I can't talk, and I hung up. But after the fact, you come up with the things you would have said, right? I'm offended by a God who's offended by the word shit. And apparently not offended by the death of my 3 friends. If God is present and gives a shit about the word shit and doesn't give a shit about my friends who have died, that God is offensive to me. I didn't say that, I just hung up. But clearly I offended this person in the memorial. Tough luck. But I got to avoid offense by hanging up. And then the really, really long email I got 2 days later I haven't replied to yet. And maybe I will, maybe I won't. And then last Sunday night, we closed the service with the Eucharist, and we sang this song. I sang the song "Jesus, Jesus," which is one of my favorite songs. It's one of the most honest prayers. It's like a modern psalm of lament, and I actually take a lot of pride in using this in our liturgy. I think it pushes the envelope, and including this as sacred music, which I believe it is. But it has the F word in it. And there was a little girl who couldn't have been maybe June's age 5, maybe a little younger. The kids had come back in with us, and she was coming up to take the Eucharist with her family, and right as I'm about to sing the line in this song, she's looking right at me. And so for the first time ever, it's been 4 years, for the first time ever, I pulled the punch. And I sang messed up instead of effed up. My point is, I don't think striving to avoid offense is so simple as a simple rule. Or that we can just reduce it to good questions that are formed by some clear rubric, or even that explaining ourselves guarantees that we won't be offensive or be offended. I think that this ambition to avoid offense is poetry. It's not science. And I think so, as much or more than any other part of the community statement, this is a matter of discernment. It's not sort of a clear prescriptive rule. It's really a matter of wisdom. It's our ability to read people and read situations and come with intention and the right posture. And I want to open and sort of ask for you all to respond in your experience of having conversations about religious matters, whatever those may be. What determined whether you felt those conversations were good or bad? So as you've had conversations with people about religious matters, what determined if they were good conversations or bad conversations? And Jim asked this at Occupy Trilogy, and that is something that's been sort of with me this week as I've thought about this. Bill?
When it was a dialogue and not an argument.
A dialogue instead of an argument.
In other words, I listened to that person and they felt understood by me and I felt understood by them. Whether or not we came to an agreement, at least there was understanding.
Okay, so listening and understanding, even if you don't agree, that there was a conversation you each could listen to each other and understand each other, even if you ultimately didn't agree. Yeah, okay. Anybody else? In the religious conversations you've had, what determined whether it was a good conversation or not, if we're sort of putting those qualifiers on it? Yeah, Jess?
An emotional connection.
Ooh, good. Emotional connection.
Usually, my husband says he knows if I like the movie, if I cry
Okay.
at the end of the movie. So not that I'm crying at the conversation, but maybe I tear up, or there's a
Okay.
connection.
Yeah, so having some emotional engagement. It's not like this detached sort of. Yeah. Okay. Good deal. I saw another hand over there. Yeah.
I think another spin on it is not having conversations about religion.
I find it to be, I'm just starting to explore my own beliefs, and having conversations, it makes me very uncomfortable.
Okay.
And people tend to find it offensive when you talk like in regular community about religion. Because they're like, oh, she's too godly, or she's too this, or too that.
Oh, yeah.
They kind of get weirded out.
Okay, so maybe the wisdom is knowing when not to have conversations about religion, and I think that's maybe a part of it too, is knowing when you're sort of in a space or with a person for whom they're sort of ready to have some of those conversations. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think it's also, is the conversation going to be, I want to learn from you. I want to understand your point of view and you to understand mine better, instead of I'm right, you're wrong. I want to make you believe what I believe.
Okay, yeah, so is the posture approaching the conversation one where you're sort of assuming that you're right and the other person's wrong, and so you've got to change their mind, or is it approaching with I want to learn from you and you're open to learn from me, and sort of have that kind of exchange? Yeah, Kate.
When the religious conversation is used to dismiss someone's experience or their feelings.
All right, so that's an unhealthy religious conversation when it's used to dismiss their experience or their feelings. Yeah, those are the toughest too, when you're trying to explain to someone that you're not making like a logical argument, but you're telling them what you've experienced, and they're trying to like argue out of what you've experienced, and it just doesn't work because you've experienced what you've experienced. But it's also equally tough to be sensitive to people who swear they've experienced something that you haven't, and then you're like, that's foreign to me, or that's new to me, or, it's tough. It's tough. Sensitive is probably a good word. Anybody else?
The best religious conversations are had over beer. The best spiritual conversations are done in the dark.
Wow, somebody get a bumper sticker manufacturer. The best religious conversations are done over beer, all right? The monastics, I see where you are. The best spiritual conversations are done in the dark, which we could take so many ways. And we really kind of have to, because it's Wayland, so... all right, so we strive to avoid offense. We see sort of, if you haven't been here the last 5 weeks, the community statement we're going through is building on itself as we work through. So we strive to avoid offense. It flows naturally from the last 5 weeks. We acknowledge from the beginning everyone's on a journey. We're diverse, including generationally diverse. We've got everyone from kids to seniors. We agree not to make assumptions about our conversation partners. We acknowledge diversity in social and spiritual locations, so what people mean by the word God and what it means for them to be followers of Jesus. And so it builds from this, but then the statement tonight also sort of moves forward. How do we strive to avoid offense? By articulating and explaining our responses. So I want to begin by going back to the question that we processed with the kids, and I think back also to the wisdom literature, because it has a perspective on the power of language and on the power of words. So I'm just going to sort of pick a handful of proverbs. This is sort of conventional wisdom for the ancient Near East. The soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit. Those who guard their lips preserve their lives, but those who speak rashly will come to ruin. For how many of you is that your prayer in this political environment? Those who speak rashly will come to ruin. What we find in the wisdom tradition is a connection between words and spirit, between speech and life. The wisdom tradition doesn't buy into sticks and stones, because for wisdom, words are connected to the very elemental, sort of essential reality of life, all of life, not just sort of this disembodied spiritual life, but everything. And so words matter. The word for word is davar, which translates both word and thing. So in the ancient understanding, words are things. Words are matter. Words matter. There's a sense of substance to what we say. Words manifest in reality. They frame and lend energy to space and time. Have you ever been totally energized and then you walk into a meeting and the first thing that's said is, oh, we have so much to get through today and corporate is breathing down our necks and I guess we better just get this over with. Words frame space. The things we say frame our energy. They frame how we approach things. They can alter the space we inhabit and the posture with which we approach it. It's another proverb. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So quick crowdsourcing by show of hands. Which is more prevalent on social media? The words of the reckless, right? Or the tongue of the wise? And there is some wisdom. There's been some good articles, right? There's good stuff. But everything on Pinterest? The wisdom's on Pinterest, yeah. Cats. Yeah, it's hard to imagine a whole lot of healing getting done on social media right now. Our words can frame a space as dangerous and wounding, or they can frame space as healing and safe. Proverbs 10 says, the lips of the righteous nourish people. And I hope that the words in the community statement help us to frame space that's safe and healing and nourishing, and a place where we're looking not to shame or dehumanize or to condescend or belittle, but we're striving to avoid offense, and a space where we're not by default afraid or defensive or insecure, and so we're striving to posture ourselves in such a way that we aren't easily offended either. So words create space. They're like architecture. The mystics actually believe that the words we inhabit are like cathedrals. And so when they're spoken, then we enter into our words. And if you think about your favorite poets and your favorite novelists, your favorite movie or your favorite author or book, they create worlds that you enter into. I mean, Harry Potter, for God's sake. People are entering into the world of Harry Potter all the time. It creates space for people to live in. And we know intuitively the kind of spaces that we like to inhabit. Safe and warm and inviting and hospitable. But very often, what spaces are we creating instead? Are we building with our words? I had this conversation a couple weeks ago, and I swear to God, in 1 hour, having coffee, this guy said 5 times, I don't mean to be offensive, right? We sort of have the caveat conversation. It's like, really? Really, you don't mean to be offensive? Because the caveat actually makes this a space where I don't feel safe, and I don't want to be here. The space is off-putting. It's immediately not where I want to hang out. And avoiding offense doesn't mean this backhanded caveat followed by the same offense that you intended the whole time. If you're really trying to avoid offense, maybe instead of a caveat, you ask a good question, or maybe you begin with an I statement, right? Like, I noticed this, and this is how that made me feel. And then you can set yourself up for a good question, like, was that what you intended? Or did I misunderstand something? And then you've got a conversation rather than that sort of caveat. We're building spaces. We're framing spaces with our words. And so striving to avoid offense, this ought not to be such a strange idea, right? This appears in every single one of the world's religions as the golden rule. Treat others the way that you want to be treated. And we said the kindergarten rule, if you don't have anything nice to say, just shut up. But maybe we can take it a step further, and I learned this a couple years ago in LGBTQ Safe Zone training before we started Collective Cares. If the golden rule is treat others as you want to be treated, the platinum rule is treat others as they want to be treated, which means you have to ask. You have to ask. And just in living by that rule, you create dialogue because you don't get to assume the way someone wants to be treated. Not even if you think you're great by treating them the way you want to be treated, they may not want to be treated that way. And so you have to ask. So maybe even before the offensive thing we ought to avoid saying is the way we frame it, these spaces that we build with our words. Are we building and framing spaces that are safe, that are welcoming, that allow vulnerability and honesty, that value ourselves, place value on others? My hope is that just by framing this each week this way, by saying every week we strive to avoid offense, to ask good questions, to articulate and explain our responses, I hope that we're building, like the mystics say, this cathedral of safety, of generous conversation, of respectful dialogue. And then at Occupy Trilogy, Lisa pointed out, it's not only avoiding offending others, but what does it mean to become people who avoid being offended? Who begin to practice a way of being where we're less offended. We actually practice trying to be less offended. And God, if there was a world where we could practice this, this is that world. This is like the perfect place to avoid, to try to avoid being offended. So I found this week, I shared with a couple people. William Gibson's an author. He actually coined the term cyberspace almost 30 years ago. So he's like another one of these sci-fi writers who's kind of like, his work hits a bit too close to home. It's almost like predictive, the way he's like seen the world 30 years on. So he has this book called Spook Country. And there's a character named Hollis Henry, and she's a journalist, and she's the adult daughter of elderly parents, and she calls to check in on her. And her mother assures her that all is well, except she says a certain strangeness in your father's mood. He's a retiree in his late 70s. He's developed a fierce and uncharacteristic appetite for politics. This is 30 years ago. So this interest, her mother tells Hollis, seems to engage his passions more than anything else, but it renders him angry, offended, and disagreeable most of the time. And she says, politics on the internet, 30 years ago. This character in his novel, politics on the internet, is like a tap running. So this author, David Dark, who does a bunch of work with offendedness, he calls the tap running all anxiety, all the time. And he says it keeps the mind going, but going where? And to what end? I feel like that question alone should frame the way we engage with social media, right? It keeps the mind going, but going where? And to what end? And Dark goes on, he says, feeling offendedness is invigorating. It might even be, God, this gives me chills. It might even be an effective way to bend a population to a tyrant's will. But we must not settle for it. This book is like 10 years old. This book by David Dark. Feeling offendedness is invigorating. It might even be an effective way to bend a population to a tyrant's will, but we must not settle for it. And I would add, whether that tyrant is a literal political figure, hypothetically, or the image of a tyrannical god that we've created, offendedness is equally powerful and it can be equally harmful. He goes on, feeling offended can be reassuring. It's much easier than asking ourselves if love is evident in the way we communicate with people. We're easily offended. Maybe we're looking to be offended, which can make us feel better about ourselves. Feeling offended summons a sense of being right, a certain strength, a kind of power, a potent shot of righteous indignation. Here's the deal. I haven't got anywhere near the wisdom nor the education to speak to the current political shit show, pardon the offense. Where and when is it right and appropriate to be offended? In each specific circumstance, I don't know. How does that offendedness play out appropriately in protest, in activism, or inappropriately in shameful and hateful personal attacks and social media ranting? I don't know. I don't know a simple way to parse that, and I really don't think there's a simple way to parse that. It's way above my pay grade and my civic intellect. Again, though, I don't think this is about a simple rule that we can just lay over everything and say we've got this right now, we've figured it out. But nor is it about denying the way that we feel. Right? Because at the end of the day, you feel what you feel. And on the flip side, regardless of your intent, you might be contributing to others feeling offendedness that they feel. We feel the way we feel. So maybe the better perspective, the deeper wisdom, is to begin asking, why do we feel the way we feel, and what are we doing with that? Our kids have been sick all week, on and off, and in some sense, when June's fever is spiking to 104, or Huck suddenly begins throwing up all over our couch, their bodies are expressing offendedness at this virus, at this sickness, or whatever it is. The symptom lets us know there's a problem. And so it would be silly, right, and it would be irresponsible of us as parents to pretend that this wasn't happening, right? To pretend that they're not getting offended. We feel what we feel. Our bodies let us know when we're sick. And so in some sense, symptoms can be incredibly useful. So when Huck throws up, when his stomach gets offended, we don't cut out his stomach, right? We don't try to extract June's immune system to get rid of the fever. We alter course and we figure out how to heal the body. We listen to the symptom, we listen to the offense, and we find out what it means to move towards healing. Socially, perhaps the same thing is true. If we're all a part of the same universal body, which, by the way, this is the dominant metaphor in the New Testament, there is no longer slave or free, Jew or Greek, male or female, Democrat, Republican, gay, straight, theist, atheist, keeps coming back to this refrain. All people are one in Christ, or the body of Christ, this Christ consciousness, or this universal consciousness. We're all participating in some sort of larger body, is sort of the assertion of this tradition. So we ought to strive to avoid offense, right? And what we're doing when we do this is we're striving to be well. Right? That's maybe a better way to put it. To strive to avoid offense is to strive to be well. We want to be whole. We want to be healthy. That's a good thing to hope for, but we can't always be. We get sick. We aren't always well, and we can't always be well. So when we offend, and when we are offended, part of how we heal that offense, rather than just rejecting the other, rather than rejecting the offender, is to ask good questions, to articulate and to explain our responses. Or we could put it a different way. We have to learn again what it means to listen to our symptoms. And our culture is speaking loudly. Not clearly, but loudly. There's a lot of offense, right? A lot of offendedness. These are symptoms, and we have to be people who are learning the wisdom of listening to those symptoms. And if we don't want to listen to those symptoms, if we'd rather just cut the extremity off or exclude or reject, if we'd rather just be offended, then we've got to be honest with ourselves. Are we actually striving to avoid offense? Are we striving to avoid being offended? And how are we doing that? Because I'm not talking about striving to avoid being offended by surrounding ourselves only with people who agree with us. Right? Like Bubble Boy, we can sort of stay well, quote unquote, by subtracting ourselves from the world and subtracting ourselves from anyone who's different or disagrees with us. But that's not this community. Right? We've been saying we're now on the 5th week, and in some form or another, we've talked about diversity almost every single week. That people are not all the same as us, and that's part of what is so important. David Dark goes on and he says, when we do this, we're in danger of becoming impenetrable to wisdom, immunized against the sensation of sympathy, resistant, I love this line, resistant to the pleasure of being amused by our own ignorance, closed to the joy of being wrong. It doesn't feel like the world I'm living in right now, but it sounds like the world I want to live in. Instead, I think when we strive to avoid offendedness, it has to at least begin by a life of self-examination. We have to learn to listen to our own symptoms. And this means not only agreeing to make not to make assumptions, but actually practicing that. Right? The agreeing is the easy part. Sure, we won't make assumptions. What does it mean to actually practice not making assumptions? And maybe it means reflecting on whether or not when that offense gets set off, when we get warm in the face, when our bodies and our blood begins to boil, when that righteous indignation flares up, to practice discerning whether that response is reactive or responsive. Because I think into that same offensive event, into the truth of injustice or inhumanity, reaction can often tend to perpetuate offense and stoke hate and fuel division, which is shutting down communication. Where response, and some of the best responses I've seen on social media, can offer humor and truth and self-critique and openness to conversation. That actually opens things up and builds bridges and gets people talking. I think this avoiding offendedness also can mean one of the most profound practices and most difficult practices, surrendering the outcome. We've talked about this before, and I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not saying surrender the issue, and I'm not saying surrender the argument or concede truth or justice or what is right or good. You can and you must stand for those convictions. You have to. But I think there's a fundamentally different posture to your interaction if you can release some of your attachment to the way that conversation will go. You can engage uncompromisingly on the side of justice, on the right side of history, without being drawn in to the offendedness and the hatred and the vitriol that characterize so much discourse. Merrill Westphal puts it like this. He says, if I'm a good listener, I don't interrupt the other or plan my own next speech while pretending to be listening. I try to hear what is said, but I listen just as hard for what is not said and for what is said between the lines. I'm not in a hurry, for there is no pre-appointed destination for the conversation. There is no need to get there, for we are already here. And in this present, I'm able to be fully present to the one who speaks. The speaker is not an object to be categorized or manipulated, but a subject whose situation is enough like my own that I can understand it in spite of the differences between us. If I am a good listener, what we have in common will be more important than what we have in conflict. I would call that surrendered listening. I would also call that hard as hell. That's not easy. But I think part of how we commit to avoid offense and offendedness is to listen like this, to ask good questions. We had one of the most vibrant discussions at Occupy Trilogy Tuesday. I just want to quickly sort of walk you through the evolution of how this conversation went. It very quickly got from like strive to avoid offense, ask good questions, and I think it was Myra who was like, well, what's a good question? We have to come up with what's a good question before we can figure out how to strive. So it just started this rapid fire, and I couldn't type fast enough. Like the keys were on fire. But essentially, it kind of moved like this. Good questions are open questions, open to questioning. Good questions are designed to be engaged, not only to be answered. A good question doesn't presuppose there is an singular answer. And Myra's friend, who's actually only been here one time, she said, I've only been once, but I love that there aren't the singular answers. They're not just an answer. And then Katie said, not every big question is a good question, but not every good question is a big question. Meaning, a good question doesn't have to be the sort of universal in scope, meaning of life, depth. A quality question can be small and unspectacular, but profoundly formative. My dad, when each of my brothers sort of got to the right stage, I don't know how my dad knew it, but he would take us all to breakfast. And this was like the coming of age talk, where it was essentially like, get your life together. He would take us to breakfast and we would just like talk or whatever. And then towards the end of the meal, he would just ask, what do you want? And then we'd talk for a while and he would be quiet. And then he would ask again, what do you want? And then we would sort of get really uncomfortable and talk for a while longer. And then he would wait. He'd go, what do you want? And it was like this profoundly formative thing, but he did it with each of my brothers. And it wasn't this spectacular question, but it was the question we needed to be formed by what he was really asking. Good questions are humanizing. They see the humanity of the other person. So we sort of began with this nature of questions themselves, and then we shifted to the posture of asking. A good question is asking to receive rather than asking to use. And you guys know this. When someone's listening to you so that they can argue with you or so that they can turn what you've said on you, instead of just receiving it, instead of actually hearing, and many of you all said that. That's what makes for good conversation. A good question is asked from the posture of vulnerability. A good question concedes power. I can't remember who said this. This might have been Nate. A good question invites sharing. It invites dialogue. A good question invites. And then somebody said the good modifier isn't actually really necessary here because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. As if we need to figure out good apart from the community statement. Good, in this case, is shaped by the intention, striving to avoid offense. So we're not talking about good or bad questions. We're talking about positive or negative intent. Are we approaching questions with the intent of avoiding offense? And then this is my favorite part. Then we got to the contrast. And this is, if you care about this stuff, ask me some other time. But it was fascinating to me how this conversation actually modeled the development of theology, and we'll talk about something else some other time. But we got to the sort of what I would call negative theology of it, where you're talking about what it is by contrast. So a bad question, somebody said, is a leading question. Questions that make assumptions, binary questions, non-open questions, questions that shut people down. Just one example. If you died tonight, where would you go? Wow, dead audience. The mortuary is the answer. Nobody. Street preachers? Anyone? No? Tough crowd. So I was in my hospice residency. I didn't realize that transition went from a death joke to hospice. Next time I won't do that. My chaplain mentor kept saying throughout the course of this hospice residency, don't ask bad questions. And she would say, these people that you're working with, they don't have time for bad questions. And this is what she meant. Don't you dare go to the bedside of a dying person and make small talk. Where are you from? How many kids do you have? What did you do for a living? What do you like to watch on TV? Right? She said, we're not writing a biography on these people. We're trying to help them die. We're trying to help them die with dignity. We're trying to help them die at peace. And so those questions, they're not about information. They're about self-revelation. They're about getting to the heart and the essence of that person's vulnerability. What they need to come to peace. Good questions cut through small talk. And let me say, though, that very often has much more to do with that good listening than it does coming up with like a magical question. I think this is what Mara Westfall is talking about. You're listening between the words for what's not being said. Or you're listening for like an emotional trigger, what it is that actually connects with the person. This one kind of blew my mind. Bad questions are lonely. Bad questions come without companionship, without dialogue partners, bad questions leave you alone. I think we're back now at the Christian tradition, right? Good questions are embodied. Good questions are incarnated. They're personal. Good questions come through people. They come with people. I would say best, they come in community. Again, I think it's not as simple as a quantitative binary metric of good and bad or right or wrong. I think it's a function always of qualitative wisdom, discernment, posture, intent. And then at the very end of the conversation, Bill Brennan says, everybody kind of got quiet. And he says, I'm hearing a lot of respect, which was just awesome because it really was the nature of that conversation. It was like 13 of us. We took over the whole patio at Trilogy. So it was true of that conversation, but I think he was also saying that's what's true about good questions. He said, I'm hearing a lot of respect, which means to look again. Respect, to look again. And maybe it's that simple and that complicated, that avoiding offense and asking good questions is built on respect. A willingness to look again at the other, the conversation partner, to look again at the question, the issue at hand, to look again at the responses that have already been offered. And I actually think the practice of articulating and explaining our responses is the practice of looking again. As we articulate and explain, we look again at the other, the person we're in conversation with. As we articulate and explain, we look again at the question, what it is we're actually talking about. And I think as we articulate and explain, as we respond rather than answer, we're open to look again at one another's responses. I think it all has to be built on and from respect. Another way to say respect is to say self-giving love. Right? Because respect, the willingness to surrender the sure footing of our perspective, your certainty that the way that you see things is the only way, is the right way, or is the singular way. To respect, to look again, is to defer to the other. To lay down your position of power, to surrender your upper hand, to meet the other where they are. To humanize another person, rather than merely converting them or rejecting them. And this should sound familiar, this posture of self-giving love. The table around which we gather every week is a table of self-giving love. It's a table of respect, of sacrifice for the sake of the other. But it's important that we understand that the symbols of body broken and blood shed are not meant to be offensive symbols of violence done against the other, but in fact of this radical invitation to avoid offense, to absorb offense, to transcend offense for the sake of love. Jesus says it like this: love your enemy. To even pray for forgiveness for those who would kill you. These are symbols of that good gift, of offering ourselves to be broken and poured out in the name of love for the healing of the world. Symbols of choosing humility over offense, choosing non-anxious presence over offendedness, engaging in the questions, even the very difficult and painful questions that break us open, and then pouring ourselves out, the very best and most life-giving responses in order to live in love. This is the table of that love. It is not easy, but it is good. As always, it has been set for us tonight. It is open to us and to all people. To all people. To all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.